Hello,
Hi.
how's it going?
Good. How are you?
Good.
Sorry, what was your name? I'm Rebecca.
My name was Theo.
Yeah, nice to meet you. So I will just make you co-host so you can share your screen.
Okay, just give me a quick second here.
Sure.
I just had a little bit of problems with Canva right before I tried to log on.
Oh, yeah.
Okay, am I good to go to share the screen?
Yeah, you should be.
Okay, just give me a quick second here then. There we go.
Yeah, perfect.
And there we go. Okay. Yeah, I don't use this computer very often. So when I do, it's like a whole nother learning curve.
Yeah, it always takes a minute. But it's good. I can hear you. Last time, for some reason, every time presenter was sharing the screen, it muted them. So I'm glad that's not happening this time.
I'm just gonna hide. No, that's not what I wanted to do. I'm just trying to figure out how to hide this toolbar up here.
Sure, yeah, no problem. I'm actually going to go and run and get my cord just to make sure my laptop doesn't die. That would be bad.
You good now, Rebecca?
Yeah, everything is good.
I'm just going to turn my phone to silent so then no distractions.
Sounds good.
Oh, hold on. I've got a major distraction here. I better get rid of her. It's a little kitten that we've adopted recently, so it's...
Oh, a very good distraction.
Very good, but I don't want to jumping up on the laptop in the middle of everything, right?
Yeah, very cute though.
This almost joins a video conference. All right. So how's your day going so far?
So far, so good. Yeah. So I don't know how many people join. Some people also, because it's live streamed to YouTube and Facebook, some people watch that way.
Yeah.
So we can wait for a few more minutes, but and then also a lot of people watch after. So yeah.
So you just tell me when you want me to get started and I'll be good to go.
Okay. Well, it's got 2 more minutes, so we might as well or 1 more minute now. My computer said.
I know that I think Sharon or someone emailed me about doing a couple more presentations.
Oh, I don't know who that would be. Not Emily?
No. I can look it up real quick. Just give me a second. I don't want to change screens on my laptop and like have an issue.
My understanding is that there's a DIGA workshop, I think once a month.
Yeah, they were asking me if I could do another one in May and June.
Oh, okay.
But I need to know the dates.
So I'm just trying to, I would think that would be Emily.
No, Sharon or something like that emailed me, program coordinator. I may not be saying that properly.
No, I think that, but I'm not, Yeah, I'm not sure who's actually organizing. But the program coordinator is Emily. So I don't, unless she got Sharon to sort of do that work for her, I'm not sure. But just, yeah, you could always like, I would just email back whoever emailed you.
I did, but I was asking them about dates and they never got back to me.
Oh, well, maybe that's why she's probably checking in maybe with Emily to make sure. As far as I know, it's Fridays, same time. And I think it's the third Friday of every month. At least that's since I've been doing this. So, but I don't know if they're changing programming in the summer. I don't know if that's maybe why she hasn't gotten back to you. But I can speak with Emily later today. I'll just tell her that you were asking.
Okay.
Yeah.
Because if the one in May might be a little problematic for me.
Okay.
Because I do 3 markets a week, and my first one is on Friday, and it's evening.
Oh, okay.
But the one in June, it should be no problem.
Okay. Okay. Well, I can tell her that, and somebody will get back to you.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, it is 1:31, so I think you could go ahead and start.
Okay.
Let me just.
When other people join, would they be joining on the Zoom call too, or no?
Yeah, if they registered and come through this way. Otherwise, if they're like watching on YouTube or Facebook, then I have no way of knowing that. But I'll admit them. Like you might hear the ding, but you can just keep going with your presentation, and I'll just admit them.
Okay.
Yeah.
It's a little bit different just talking to you versus a big crowd of people.
Yeah, I know. I think I always try and say, like, there's more people than it looks like. Just imagine there's more.
Yeah.
I'll just mute myself.
So we're good to go. Hey everyone, my name is Theo, and along with my family, we own Spectrum Gardening. And the way it started was, it's basically based all around autism. Growing up, I was never diagnosed being on the spectrum. So I never really realized why I didn't fit in, why I had all these difficulties and things like that. And I went through quite a few different issues during my childhood and my teenage years. And it wasn't until my daughter went for her diagnosis as well that the pieces began to click together. They're like, oh yeah, you know what? I actually might be on the spectrum as well. You know what? I fit all this criteria. And it was kind of a light bulb moment for me. And I was struggling with self-regulation through my whole life. And at our first house in Chilliwack, I started dabbling in the garden, and I realized how calming it was, how regulated I would be in the garden when I was out there. And my wife said, like, you know what? Like, why don't you go out there, relax, like, center yourself, figure out exactly kind of how you can be helping regulate yourself a little bit more versus having meltdowns and things like that. So it kind of started like that. And I realized how therapeutic gardening actually is. I'm not sure how many of you are actually that familiar with autism, but meltdowns can occur over the smallest things, like spilled glitter or misplanted beans that are not perfectly in a row or things like that. And the smallest thing that wouldn't necessarily, you would think that would set off a meltdown or something like that, it will, because it doesn't fit into our linear way of thinking. We think things have to be done in a certain way. They have to be a certain result and things like that. It's really great for gardening, but typically during life, things don't always go according to plan. So, obsession is a very common trait among people on the autism spectrum. And we have to get things done right now. Like last winter, we had about 4 feet of snow, and there I was, I really have to move this soil. So I went out with a wheelbarrow, and I was pushing the wheelbarrow through about 4 feet of snow. This was only when I was about 2 feet or so it wasn't that bad. But needless to say, by the time I was actually getting near the end of the project, my wheelbarrow wheel was actually getting chocked full of snow. I could barely push it. but you know what, in my mind, I had to get it done. So I just continued working. It's like this other garden bed. I was working on it all day and all night, and it became night and I could hardly see. So I went out and got a headlamp, and I got a couple other spotlights so I could actually see what I was doing. You know, gardening can be extremely rewarding because of the amount of sensory input. And at the end of the day, you can actually see the result of what you're working on. You can see, hey, you know what? I planted all these plants. I planted these beans, or I built a garden bed, or I filled it up with soil. You can actually see the end of day result versus not actually knowing what you worked on all day. So you could say that gardening really helped me bloom, quite literally too. You can see how all those flowers have got in my hair. We did that during the pandemic because we had a lot of flowers going on. It was about to rain. We're going to lose them. So I thought, you know what, let's do something fun. And you know, like it's really helped me kind of come out of my shell and be a more regulated and calmer individual. You know, maybe putting flowers in your head isn't for everyone like you, like me, but you know what, you'll always find your own different way of doing things and things like that. So a lot of people on the autism spectrum, we struggle with a sense of fitting in. We struggle with a sense of community. And I know personally, going through all my childhood, I could never really figure out where I could be accepted. Where was it really okay to be myself and not have to mask in public? And you know, through gardening, I've been able to find a huge community that accepts me for who I am, whether it be having flowers in my hair or whether having my hair up in a straight up kind of like a garden troll or things like that. We're no longer really perceived as weird people when we do these things. We're perceived as crazy gardeners. There's a slight difference. I talked a little bit about the sensory aspect of gardening. You know, there's so many different movements in gardening. There's fine motor skills, there's gross motor skills, there's having to plant little seeds, there's having to plant beans and things like that. And there's also like raking and shoveling and things like that. So you get all this sensory input and you get this physical work that you have to do. And not only that, when you walk outside after you've layered a fresh layer of manure on your garden beds, you're hit almost by the sun's smell. And for me, it's a calming smell. It's calming, like, okay, I'm breathing in, I don't want to say stench because, you know, some manure doesn't smell that bad, but I'm breathing in this really strong smell that just kind of brings me focused back into myself. And plus, when I've had my hands in the soil and they're covered in dirt and things like that, it's just so calming. Like in the middle of summer, when you go out to the garden bed and the top of the soil is hard and crusty and it's warm, and you start digging your hands deeper into the soil, and the soil starts feeling a little bit more moist, it becomes a little bit more cooler, and the further down that you get, the texture and the temperature changes in the soil. For me, the contrast versus the top and the bottom, it's so calming. And you can see our daughter, well, she likes to garden too. This was a bed of dill I planted, and she would like to just go lay on that bed and just to have that smell waft over her. It was just kind of so relaxing for her that there is sometimes that I swear she took a small nap in there. Everyone has their own little styles of gardening. But especially for people on the autism spectrum, we can think differently. We can think differently than what has been generally recommended what to do, or we can have a different way of doing it. Like if you take example for this picture over here, I planted all my broccoli down and then I stuck my leeks alongside them because that's what made sense for me. And not only we have the ability to think outside the box, but also we can do things exactly the way that we want, so it makes sense for us. It makes sense in our mind. If you notice all my rows, they're all almost perfectly straight, along there, along there, along there. For me, it made sense to do that. I could organize the plants the way that it kind of made sense for me to put them down. But also, we can't finish things halfway. We can't just put down a pot, fill it up with soil, walk away, and plant in it later. We have to go from point A all the way to point B without stopping. Gardening is almost mathematical. It's almost logical. If you have certain steps that you can follow, like watering, giving enough sun, giving enough light, and giving enough food, most likely it will produce results, unless you're a really bad gardener. And in that case, it's just a little bit more practice. The results at the end of the day, when you're able to go into the garden and pick what you've grown either that day or throughout the season, is extremely rewarding. It's basically a huge boost of confidence. It's like, I put my blood, sweat, and tears. I put my effort into growing this, and now I can literally see the fruits of my labor. I can see it all gathered in one spot. It's a great visual for people like myself who need to see things, who need to be able to have that visual aspect and saying, okay, I can actually see what I've done. And take a look at all these tomatoes. All these tomatoes are not even a full season harvest. That's just kind of what I picked that day. Going out in the morning and filling up a basket or a container or a box or things like that, and taking it back home with you and be like, okay, now I've grown all these veggies. I have all this harvest that I've done myself. It's a huge boost of confidence, especially for people that may have felt later on like, I'm not good at sports. I'm not good at music. I can't draw or things like that. But look at all the stuff I can grow. One of the things I've specialized in over the years is growing vertically. For the longest time, we didn't have very much space at all. We lived in a mobile home park. And you can imagine, the lack of space. I know a lot of people, they live in more urban spaces than me. We used to live out in Chilliwack, but I know a lot of people, they live more in the city, and then they may not even have a backyard. They might be growing on a patio or things like that. So when we moved to Chilliwack, I really had to scratch my head, kind of think, how can I actually maximize this space? How can I actually make it so I'm able to grow and harvest everything I want to get out of here? Well, the simple thing is by growing vertically. It's to keep accessibility in mind. The reason that's in the forefront of my mind is because I also have a heart condition. I've had multiple open heart surgeries, so I can't run a marathon. I can't climb a mountain. I can't do a triathlon. I physically can't do those things. So when I'm making gardens and when I'm in the garden, I have to think, how can I make this accessible for myself with my physical limitations? How can I make this accessible so when I have very little energy, when I have a off day, how am I going to be able to work, and how am I going to be able to actually enjoy being in the garden? So if you can't grow up, another idea is to divide the space into smaller sections, like these garden beds here. That way it's more manageable. That way, instead of looking at a huge garden bed, okay, well, I have to weed this whole thing, you can focus on just this part here, or this part, or just the top, and you can take on that one task. And having it broken up like that visually can make it much easier for someone that struggles either with executive function or with physical limitations. Whoops. So when we built our greenhouse, I really had to think, how am I going to maximize this? I know a lot of people, they may not have greenhouses or things like that, but the same kind of idea can be used to create a keyhole garden. A keyhole garden would be a shape like this, where you physically kind of be able to put in a key like that. What I did is I built my beds in a U shape, and they're less than 2 feet wide. So I can easily be on one side of the garden bed and reach all the way across to the other side. And then I also put shelves on them, so I could put all my seedlings on top. So within only a 6x8 garden greenhouse like this, I was able to fit, I think it was 400 or 700 different seedlings or something like that. So I was able to increase the space quite a bit. So I know there's lots of interesting things on Pinterest and they're like, wow, this is a great idea. But you know, one of the big concerns about creating garden is water and soil health. They are the main concerns. Take a look at this pyramid planter here a little bit. That pyramid planter is going to be extremely hard to water. Yeah, it's a great idea for strawberries, but in reality, these shelves here are going to be so narrow. It's going to be hard to keep them well watered. And the top of this, all the water is going to drain down. So the top will be consistently drier than the bottom. And if you water the top enough to keep it hydrated, well, the bottom's going to be flooded. So in real life, it doesn't quite work, despite how cool they look. And you know, like this is a great, beautiful backdrop to sit behind. But we all know how hot our summers have been getting. And imagine trying to water those pots enough during the day. I wouldn't personally even want to think about how many times I have to go out there with a hose to either hose them down or set up a sprinkler. And you know, they've got a great idea over here. They're making it accessible over here. They're leaning up the trellis panels against the back of the beds so they can walk along the back here and they can easily pick everything. So I talked a little bit about accessibility before. Accessibility is huge in the garden. If you can't access something, you're not going to do it. If you're having trouble with it, honestly, you're not going to do it. If it's not fun to be out there, you're not going to be in the garden at all. If you take a look at this trellis that was put along the back over here, despite me explaining to the person, you're like, you know, you really don't want it. She was adamant that she wanted it there. The issue with this is the garden bed was about 4 feet wide. So she'd either have to step on the garden bed about halfway to reach all the plants along there, or she would have to reach around, trying to walk around the back and try and kind of stick her hands through the mesh. And the same issue is over here. You have to think, how long is your arm reach? If you're a giant and you have a 6 foot long arm reach, sure, reaching across a 4 foot garden bed is going to be no problem. But you know, typically people have right around a 2 foot length arm reach. So if you are installing a trellis on the back of the beds along here, you want to keep the beds no wider than 2 feet. So let's talk about a little bit about accessibility picking. You know, chicken wire is a great cheap item that they have at a lot of stores like Home Hardware, Home Depot, and things like that. But can you imagine sticking your hands through there to try and pick the harvest on the other side? It's nearly impossible. Or think about trying to, when you have cucumber growing through it, it's going to kind of get stuck in the middle of it. And then you'll literally have to cut the cucumber to get it out. They're going along a better route here. They've got bigger mesh to reach their hands through, but they don't have any supports. So let's say their peas grew up here, or the beans grew up here along here, or they have pumpkins. The weight of those pumpkins or squash, or if they have a lot of cucumbers, it's going to collapse that wire arbor. So having adequate supports is key. So I was talking a little bit about accessibility earlier. This garden bed's only 2 feet wide, so they can easily be on one side of the garden bed and reach all the way across from the other one. Arbors, if you're building arbors, don't go a 4 foot arbor across your whole garden beds. Only make it about 2 feet or something like that, right around 22 inches. So you can easily wrap your arms around each side. But when you're thinking about growing your plants up it vertically, you have to think about the plant growth and the days of maturity and pruning. How are you going to do all that? Are you going to be planting something that's going to grow a vine? If so, then it's great to kind of grow it up the arbor or trellis. It's going to latch on and it's going to go up. Or are you going to be planting something more bush? If you're going to be planting something more bushy, you're going to have a very difficult time training it to go up here. And if you're thinking about days of maturity, you want to also keep in mind, you know what, maybe I'm planting this pumpkin to go along to climb up the back of my trellis. And, you know, pumpkins get really big. They're going to overshadow things. But before it gets really big, maybe I can stick some bush beans in front of it. Maybe I can get a harvest off that way, and I can help maximize the space a bit more. So if you take a look at these examples of these two garden beds here, the trellises here aren't blocking any parts of the bed. They're right in the middle. Like this one here, this garden bed is only 4 feet wide and it's right down the middle. So you have easy access to both sides of the garden bed, and you can pick easily off the trellis. And the holes on the garden bed, they're about 6 by 6 holes. So you can easily take a whole hand and you can stick it through there all the way to the other side and pick what you need to do. Same with this garden bed. This garden bed would be 4 feet this way and 4 feet this way. And you'd easily be able to be on either side of the garden bed and reach up to the trellis and pick from either side of it. Yes, it is quite a bit tall. So unless you're a giant, you will need a ladder or some kind of step stool to reach up to the very top. I talked a little bit about trellises earlier and arbors. I was mentioning how arbors should only be about 2 feet wide or something like that, plus or minus, depending on the mesh that you have. Some of them come in different increments. Some come in 6 by 6 or 4 by 4 or things like that. If you take a look at this arbor, this person had put it right between their two garden beds, and her two garden beds are right around 4 feet wide. So she wouldn't be able to access both sides of the garden beds very easily with the arbor right here. So with the arbor that was about 2 feet wide, she would easily be able to stand here and reach around to this side of the arbor, or stand on the other side and reach around there. And you can see that even without being at the very end of the season, how much the plants have enjoyed climbing up here. I think she's got a tomato on this side, and she's got a pumpkin going up here. By the end of the season there, it was just covered in greenery, and it was quite beautiful. Here's a couple more glamour shots. Yeah, there was a pumpkin growing up that side right there. And there's purple buckwheat growing there. You know, you don't have to be going out and buying trellises. You don't have to be going and spending a lot of money. Things can be upcycled. Things can be recycled. You know, sometimes it takes a little bit of imagination to make things work in the garden. Take a look at this. I think this was a white wire shelf that the person had just taken and just grown vertically up it. And you know, plants don't care what things look. They just want functionality. They just want to be able to latch onto things, and they want to be able to grow up. So like we humans, we're the ones that care about things being pretty. We're the ones that care about, oh, does it look nice or things like that. The plants don't care. They just want to grow, and they want to grow. They want to grow vertically. So this small space is what we had in Chilliwack, and you can see that we ended up packing a lot of stuff in there, and I did it in such a way. I built my supports, and then I was able to kind of grow around them. So don't let your small space fool you into what you may not be able to do. We only had like 250 square foot of garden space in the whole backyard. And you can see in the middle of our backyard, we had this great big garden bed that we just went up vertically on. And this was before we actually put a greenhouse and a gazebo back there as well. So we were able to cram quite a bit of stuff in the backyard. Let's take a look at these trellises. So these are the ones in our new place over here. So when we moved here, I also thought, you know what, I want to think about sun exposure. Because if you put your trellises in the front of the beds along here, and your sun is coming from this way, well, everything behind those trellises is going to be shaded by the plants growing up. So before you install any infrastructure, go and look at the way the sun comes to your garden. All my trellises here are built along the back of the beds, so they're not going to shade anything out. And the arbors are put in the front. with careful forethought, you can easily double the amount of growing space that you have. I think on these 4 beds, we have roughly 300 or 250 to 300 square feet of floor space, of garden space. And by going up here and putting kind of a T on the back of these trellises and along there, I have easily doubled that. And you know what I'll be doing is I'll be growing all my vines up and along these trellises here along the back. And then all my shorter stuff I'll be growing in the front to kind of have it maximize my space a little bit more. So even if you only have 1 garden bed or something like that, don't be afraid about sticking a trellis along the back of it and growing things up vertically and then increasing the amount of growing potential that you have. So we all know that garden space is a premium. There can never be enough of it. So what do you do when you want to plant lots of things and you have very little space? Well, you focus on multi-harvest crops. I'm not talking about growing a great big one cut head of lettuce. I'm talking about growing baby leaf lettuce that you can pull off multiple times, salad greens, bush beans, basil, nasturtiums, things like that. And the good thing about this is, you know, like take a look at this picture. I've got tomatoes planted along there, and the whole middle was open like this. And what that does with having exposed soil, it increases my evaporation. And the top of the soil heats up, it becomes kind of crusty, and the microorganisms get kind of killed on the top. So the best way to do it is to mulch it. But if you have a small garden, you don't really want to be wasting your space buying bark mulch or things like that. You can fill it with a living mulch. And when a living mulch, I mean other plants. You interplant them along here, and you fill up the soil that way. And like when we had these nasturtiums planted, the nasturtiums were planted on the edge. The bush beans were planted in the middle there. When we had the bush beans planted in the middle and the nasturtiums on the side, I hardly had to water that garden bed. I could pull back the leaves of the bush beans and the soil would still be moist. Because the plants grew so much kind of intertwined with each other like this, they almost create a shield over the garden, over the soil. And it kind of prevented all the evaporation. And I was astonished of how well it worked the first year. And ever since then, I've always planted bush beans among my tomatoes, just because they work so well. So as I've talked a lot about bush beans, well, that's because I grow them every year along my tomatoes. They're easy to harvest like this. You can just kind of push your hand in and kind of easily harvest them. But the other thing is when you're growing them, you have to look at the days of maturity of how long the harvest is. Do you want a really long harvest bush bean that when the tomatoes are going to be coming in, that you can be harvesting both of them? Or do you want a shorter date of maturity? The bush beans are going to be ready they're going to be ready slightly before your tomatoes. And then the rest of the time, they just basically create a barrier over the soil. Root veggies tend not to be very well interplanted along vertical veggies that like tomatoes or pumpkins or things like that, just because the root system of those vertical veggies gets so big, they kind of interfere with the root veggies. The root veggies just can't form a big enough root system to grow through that. So when you're thinking about planting, interplanting among your plants that you're going to be growing vertically, you want to focus on cut and come again veggies, multiple harvest ones that grow above the soil, and then you can harvest above the soil. There is a huge amount of trial and error involved. Every garden's different. Every garden has a slightly different microclimate, and it takes time to balance effort versus yield per square foot. How much effort are you wanting to put in to actually get your harvest? Do you want to put a huge amount of effort to get a little bit more amount of harvest? No, neither do I. My energy level has to be always taken into consideration of things. Just because I have to be very well aware of where I'm kind of spending it, because there's some days that I have very low energy or I'm having heart issues. So I need to focus on low effort, high yield. Let's talk a little bit about trial and error. I had a great idea one year, the first year we had a greenhouse. Like, you know what? I want to plant, I had garlic planted along here. I'm like, well, I don't want to rip out the bed because I can still get a bit of a harvest out of it before the fall comes. So I thought I would plant bush beans. And well, you can kind of see what happened. It kind of went crazy. Not only I had bush beans, but I had nasturtiums there. I had, it looks like I had pumpkin, also a pumpkin. So to say it was a jungle was an understatement. To say it was a mess was an understatement. But you know what? I learned, and I did get something out of there. And there's always going to be some trial and error. Let's say you try growing vertically, or you try interplanting one year and it doesn't quite work. Don't give up. Try something different again the next year. Try something with different veggies. Try it in a different spot. Try it with a different infrastructure in place. So when you're growing vertically, you need to focus on just certain varieties. Some varieties of tomatoes just won't grow up rebar like these ones do. A lot of the determinate varieties will grow into more of a bush. They don't really require so much pruning and things like that. They're actually not that much work, which is kind of better. It's a trade-off. But when you're looking at tomatoes to grow vertically, you want to look at indeterminate tomatoes, which are more the vine type, the ones that are going to grow until basically our cold weather kills them. And the big plus about indeterminate tomatoes is that you get a harvest all year, not all year, but all season long. Bush tomatoes, they only provide a harvest at one point. So pumpkins, squash, pole beans, melons, those are all great ideas that you can be planting that can grow vertically. You just have to keep in mind not to be choosing the bush varieties, because there are bush varieties of pumpkins that will kind of grow like this, same with squash. And those varieties, they're going to be very challenging in small spaces. So let's talk a little bit about amending the soil and kind of the benefits of compost versus manure versus fertilizer. We all know that garden soil is the most important aspect of growing. That's going to be your foundation for everything. If you have bad soil, you're going to struggle, to say it plainly. Yes, you can amend it over time, and you can fertilize it and things like that. But the plants, they need to have a good base to start with. What I recommend for people to do is when they're setting up a new garden, spend as much as you can to get the best soil possible. There's time and time again that I've seen people go out and try and buy the cheapest soil because they're trying to save money. And then for years, they struggle. They struggle with amending it. They struggle with getting enough organic matter in it. And I've actually seen people have to dig out their whole gardens, remove that soil, and replace it later on. So keep in mind, when you're creating a new garden, buy the best soil possible. So compost. We all know about compost, right? It's touted, it's talked about one of the best amendments for the garden. Well, in some senses, yes, it is. It's one of the best amendments. You can produce it at home for relatively cheap. You can have your own compost pile at home. There's huge amounts of organic matter in the compost. And when you make it at home, it's 100% controllable inputs. You're making sure you're not putting any invasive weeds in there. You're not making sure you're not putting any like plastic bits or things like that. And it's full of beneficial microorganisms and microbes and minerals. So there's a whole bunch of great things about compost. But there's also a few not so great things about compost. So city compost. We all know about how city collects the green waste these days, and they kind of they send it through their process. And a lot of cities will actually sell it back to the homeowners, or I know in the case of Mission, they'll actually give it to them because they had so much. Well, how many times have you personally taken a weed from your garden and throw it in your green waste pile? I know I have. I know I've been guilty of that. Grass clippings can also be sprayed with herbicides for people that want the picture perfect lawn. And compost is actually relatively low on the NPK scale. So NPK stands for nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. So even though there's all these great things I talked about it, personally, I would never buy or get city compost to use in my garden because of all the issues. You know, they can be having meat and fish bones. They can be having plate scrapings from people's half-eaten food. They can be having old pizza boxes and grass clippings and things like that. And you got to think, how well are they cooking this? How well is this compost finished? Because I know a lot of the time the cities and a lot of commercial places, they want to sell their compost quickly. So they'll sell it kind of half finished. And when I say half finished, I mean that they're having the thought process that you're going to take it home and it's going to mellow out on your garden. And you know, that's great for them to think about it. But if you're taking this in the spring and applying it to your garden, it can actually burn your plants. Or if it's not that, or if it has invasive weeds in it, those invasive weeds haven't been cooked enough and they're going to come back in your garden with a vengeance. Plus, it's relatively hard to produce a large amount of compost at home for the average gardener, unless you have an acreage and a very small garden. Manure. This is by far my favorite amendment for the garden. The reason for that is because it's relatively cheap or even free, depending where you live. I live out more in the country. I live in Fraser Valley. So we're like in the farming capital of BC, pretty much. There's a farm pretty much a stone's throw away from me at every block. So I can source it pretty well, pretty much anytime I want. And there's sometimes that if you go to Craigslist or go to Facebook, a lot of people will be giving it away for free. And you know what? It provides a huge boost of bacteria to the soil's ecosystem. It's a great source of micro and macronutrients. And you know, the best thing is it's a renewable resource. If we have farms, we're always going to have manure. And the farmers are always going to have to get rid of their manure. And believe me, if you're a farmer, you're not really wanting to pay to dump your manure. So keep your eye on social media. I know that I belong to quite a few gardening groups, and some farmers will say, come get my manure. Just it's a kind of a you shovel type of deal here. And those posts are great because not only does it help you out as a gardener, but it helps the farmer out as well. But with every good thing, there can be some bad things. So manures can contain traces of herbicide, especially on huge farms like grazon. And grazon will affect the soil for years. And it will affect your crops for years. And you know, yes, you can slowly grow it out there, And when I mean slowly grow it out, I mean it's only time. It's only going to take time for the herbicide residue to drop down to levels that it's not going to be affecting your crops. Manure is actually relatively low on NPK. And the amount of nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium varies greatly on what type of manure that you're getting, whether it be horse or whether it be dairy manure or whether it be goat or whether it be alpaca. It also matters on the type of bedding that the manure is mixed in with. Is there a lot of hay, or is there a lot of wood chips or things like that? It also matters what the animals eat it. The higher quality of food the animals are eating, the higher quality of manure that you get. The lower quality of food, the lower quality manure you get. It's a simple mathematical. And most, not all, but most type of manure must be aged properly before the application. The reason I'm saying it must be aged properly because I talked a little bit about how compost can burn your garden if it's applied too early in the year. And that's the exact same thing with manure. if you apply it too early, it's going to quite literally burn your plants. And that's because of the nitrogen factor in that. It's because of the urine from the animals. So the best time to be applying the manure is in the fall if you're getting it straight from the farmer. If you're not getting it straight from the farmer, and let's say you live more in the city and you source your manure from the bags from the hardware store and things like that, what you want to be doing, you still want to apply it in the fall because it's going to give the manure a little bit more time to kind of integrate into your soil. Plus, if you apply it over your soil over the fall, it's going to protect it over the hard frost of winter, and it's going to protect it over all the rain that we have. I talked a little bit about how different manures contain about different things. One of the things that I hear quite often from other gardeners is how mush manure is a magic manure, how we love it so much. Well, it's very low in nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium, and it's quite a bit lower than the other manure, other actual animal manures. The reason for that is because it starts out as animal manure. The mushroom farmers, they take it and they grow their mushrooms out of it. They take a lot of the nutrients out of it for their crops. So it's mostly just organic matter. And it's very alkaline because after they've finished with their cycle, they'll kind of cook the manure a little bit and they'll add lime to it. So it's extremely problematic if you're growing crops that love acidic soil, like blueberries, rhododendrons, or azaleas. My favorite manure of all time is goat manure. The reason for that is because goats, they have a stomach that will destroy everything. And they can eat even bindweed, blackberries, or even Japanese knotweed, and you will not ever get seeds from them. Like you can put them in a Japanese knotweed patch, and they'll eat that Japanese knotweed right down to the stalks, and you can take the manure and you can apply it to your garden with no problem whatsoever. I know I was talking a little bit to how goat is my favorite, but if you look at the NPK of it, it's pretty balanced along here. It's got 1.4% nitrogen, it's got 0.5 phosphorus, and it's got 0.5 phosphorus and 1.2 of potassium. If you take a look along this chart here, you can see I've kind of outlined the different values of the manure. One, I talked a little bit about the social media aspect of getting free manure. A lot of the times, the manure that you'll see free is horse manure. That's because the farmers they have to get rid of it because nobody really wants it. The reason for that is because it contains such a high amount of weeds. Horses, they don't digest their food very well at all. So they have to eat a lot. And it goes pretty much straight through them. So when you apply that manure, you'll get seeds that kind of will come up and things like that through it. And it's a headache for gardeners. It really is. I've spoken to a few different gardeners over the years that have gotten horse manure for free, and they've had it dumped all over the front lawn of the garden, and the weeds have literally just taken over. So let's talk a little bit about the bedding, a little bit about the manure. I talked a little bit about how bedding affects the manure before. So the dairy cow, let's take a look at this. So it's no bedding. The pounds to apply if you want 0.2 pounds of nitrogen available per 100 square feet is 75 pounds. And that's when it's fresh. So with bedding, you're looking at 95 pounds. And when it's fully composted, broken down, and kind of ready to grow in, you're looking at 200 pounds per 100 square feet. That's a lot of manure to be applying to a 100 square foot garden. You can see how it kind of varies with each different type here. If I had to pick the best type of manure to use, it would be either sheep or it would be goat manure. That being said, there are different types. Each type has pros and cons. I use quite often dairy manure, but it's separated dairy manure. So the farmer has taken it, they've sent it through a conveyor, and they've literally squeezed all the water out of it. But they've also squeezed all the nitrogen out of it, because nitrogen is water soluble. It's going to come with the water. So this manure, it's great for building new beds with, because it's such a high organic matter there, but it's also very high in carbon. So the issue with using it is you have to heavily amend with nitrogen fertilizer for the first year, or else your microorganisms are going to be tied up breaking down that carbon aspects of this manure. It's a great product. I really like it. I use it quite often myself, but everything has its pros and cons, right? Fertilizers. We all know when we go to the garden store, they've got a great big wall of fertilizers to choose from, and they always have a recommended one that they sell, that they always sell, that they can kind of use for everything and things like that. The great thing about fertilizers is it's a guaranteed analysis. If you want 10, 10, 10, so if you want 10% nitrogen, 10% phosphorus, and 10% potassium, you can go buy that, no problem. They have clear instructions for use, and it provides a large amount of macro and micronutrients without having to push and pull huge amounts of wheelbarrow. And you can easily target certain areas in your garden. Let's say you only want to apply manure to one part of your, let's say you only want to apply fertilizer to one part of your garden bed, because let's say that's where you've got your garlic growing and you want to give it a good boost of nitrogen. Then you can do that easily with fertilizer. You can't do that so much with manure, because you can, but it requires a little bit more skill. It requires a little bit more organization to keep it kind of separate. And the best thing is with fertilizer, there's no lingering smell. You're not going to be walking out to your garden and walking into a stench of manure. And you can easily transport it either in your car. Let's say you can even take it on the bus or something like that. And you're not going to be getting any funny looks because you're carrying a big smelly bag of manure. But there are some cons to it. You know, fertilizer costs money. It can be very expensive if you're applying it to a large area of plants. Synthetic fertilizers, they've been used quite a bit in conventional farming. They can burn plants if they're not carefully applied. The reason for that is because the chemical fertilizers, the synthetic ones, are typically not slow release. They're going to release all their nutrients pretty much all at once. And for that plant to take up all that nutrients all at once, it can potentially burn them. It can be a kind of overloading the plants with too much of a good thing, with too much nitrogen. And to get the best results and without really throwing away your money, you must regularly apply them for maximum results. If you just apply them once in the beginning of the year, yeah, that's a great start. But you know, your plants, they're going to be hungry for the rest of the season. You need to continually feed them throughout the season. So it can add up quite a bit. And you know, for someone that has trouble with scheduling or executive function or things like that, remembering to do it can be quite challenging. If you're an organic grower like myself, you need to keep in mind that organic fertilizers, they take about 3 weeks to break down, because you're not actually feeding the plant directly like you are with synthetic fertilizers. You're feeding the soil. And when you apply the organic fertilizer to the soil, the microorganisms in the soil, they break down that fertilizer. You're actually feeding the ecosystem in the soil, and in turn, the soil is feeding your plants. So you have to kind of do a little bit more planning. You have to think, okay, well, yeah, I have to apply it this week and then every 3 weeks from now and things like that. And they can only be applied when the soil is around 10 degrees Celsius or warmer, because that's when the ecosystem becomes most active in the soil. That's when all the microorganisms wake up, and that's when they're thinking, okay, now it's time to start working. If you're applying it when it's cold and things like that, it's not going to work. There's not going to be the maximum amount of microorganisms available to break down that fertilizer and in turn to feed your plants. So when can you add them? I've talked a lot about how manure and compost has to be aged properly, how fall application is the best so it can mellow out, especially if you're out in the country like myself. I'll go out to a farmer and I'll get manure in the fall and I'll sheet my beds with it. And I'll leave it like that over the winter. It'll protect my beds. And in the spring, late summer, spring, I'll go out with a rake and I'll gently rake the top of the bed just to kind of work it in a little bit. And then I'll kind of take it from there. But you know, like people in the city, they don't really have that ability that I may have out here. So if you can't source it directly from a farmer and you're buying bags of it, yeah, you know, like I would still recommend applying it in the fall so you can protect your soil, but you can also do it in the spring, no problem. But it has to be fully composted and fully aged. The reason for that with manure is because it's so important, because it can actually carry diseases and make you sick. Let's say you're planting root veggies in the area where you're planning to put manure. Manure must be applied 120 days before harvest, so it can be broken down, and so there's like the veggies physically won't make you sick. And it has to be 90 days for any above ground veggies. So I know I talked about applying in the fall. Well, if you look at some tomato plants, right? Some tomato plants, they're 90 days to maturity. So technically you could apply manure right at the start of your season. And if you have a 90-day maturity tomato plant or a pumpkin or something, things like that, technically you'd be fine because there's enough time that's passed. There's enough time for the microorganisms to break down all the stuff in the manure. Organic fertilizers have to be applied regularly. Synthetic fertilizers, same thing, but synthetic fertilizers have to be applied more regularly. They have to be applied almost on a weekly basis to get the results that you need. A lot of people, they'll go out and they'll take a look at the garden. They're like, okay, and they'll start guessing kind of how much fertilizer and what kind of fertilizer they need to apply. Well, it's a great kind of guide to do that. The best way I'd recommend though is go out and get a proper lab test. I did one myself last year because I had some issues with I had some issues with growth. I assumed it was lack of nitrogen, but I actually sent my soil off to a lab and I did one of the most detailed tests that I could. And I think I ended up paying right around $75 for the most detailed test. So it wasn't outrageous, but I got all my macronutrients outlined and all of my micro, the pH, I got the amount of organic matter in my soil. So it was well worth it. And the test came back and it told me that I was lacking nitrogen, what I thought. So if you are, like when I was out in the garden, I was thinking I had a problem. My leaves were yellowing like this. It wasn't really growing. I could see that it was quite struggling. For those who might not be that familiar with nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium, well, nitrogen is the one that basically grows your leafy parts of the plant, your leaves and your stems and things like that. Phosphorus is going to be growing your plant, your flowers, and your roots. Along with your flowers is your fruits too. And potassium is kind of for overall health. This year I went out and I did just a basic soil test. I think this one ran me about $34 or something like that, just because I was doing just the big three of them. I was just doing the nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium because I already knew my levels from previous years. And when I got it back, it was like $34 or something like that. It was very cheap compared to the other one. And my nitrogen came back as a good level compared to last year. if you are out in the garden and you're trying to figure out what the best course of action is to do without a soil test, well, you can kind of take a look at your leaves here. A lot of these will be lack of, a lot of these over here, there'll be lack of, or there'll be too much of. Potassium is kind of for overall health, but what you should also be considering is when you're using mush manure, is mush manure has a very high salt content. So if you're using a lot of it in your garden year after year, year after year, you can actually be building up your salt levels in it, and it actually can become toxic to your plants. So while the visual guide is great for gardens, for trying to figure out what nutrients you might be missing or too much, I highly recommend getting a soil test. And that way it can potentially be saving you money in the long run without having to apply fertilizers and things like that to it. So I want to also talk a little bit about gardening overall. You know, when I was growing up, I couldn't do a lot of sports. I couldn't do a lot of things. So what I spent is I spent time going to the community garden with my mom. I spent time in the kitchen, kind of learning things about that. And you know, like when I'm out in the plants, when I'm out in the garden, a whole calm comes over to me. I've talked about a little bit about special interests with people on the autism spectrum. Like, you know, like we like to talk about everything and anything a lot of the time, but we'll have our special interest that we just solely want to talk about just that. For me, it's plants. And like, you know, I'm thrilled that I have the opportunity to talk about plants all day, every day. Gardening can be such a relaxing format for people on the spectrum, even if it's not their special interest. Let's say they go out to the garden, they're digging their hands into the soil, and they're having the sunshine come down on them. They're having the different textures in the soil, and they're having things like that. You can actually see them relax when they're out there, whether it be that they're listening to the noises of nature, the birds and the bugs and things like that, and the wind. You can actually see them relax. And like, you know, maybe it's not going to be their thing. Maybe their version of gardening is just going out to the garden and just relaxing and just eating the produce. And you know what? That's fine. That can be their type of gardening as well. I know our daughter, as much as she likes it, her favorite thing in the garden is just basically eat what I grow. And you know, there's nothing wrong with that. She's out there, she's connecting with nature, and she's enjoying it the way it is. A lot of the time, you know, it does take a bit of time to kind of get into it. Maybe it's not going to be your favorite thing at first. Maybe it's going to be kind of hard to get your child or your spouse or anyone that you know to kind of relax, to get out there and kind of relax and enjoy the time. But you know what you can be doing? You can just be slowly interrupting. Hey, you know what? Why don't you come sit in the garden with me? How about we go relax in there for a cup of tea? And these days, you know, electronics are huge. Like being on your phone, being on your device is a huge thing. And sadly, that's kind of where our society is going more and more towards. We're kind of losing that disconnect with nature. And, you know, like reconnecting with nature will be huge. It'll be so beneficial for people to kind of go back into kind of where they started from, and to kind of just relax a little bit more and take it a little bit slower. We're rushing so much to do things these days. Come on, we got to get it done. We got to get it done. To actually take the time and relax and to reconnect, and just to take a breath and enjoy, it'll make a world of difference. And you know, like not everyone is good at everything. You know, sometimes we're only good at certain things, and it's all about finding the niche. Maybe like, you know, like maybe sports isn't your thing, like it wasn't with mine. Maybe gardening is. And for the families that have children on the spectrum, like, you know, forcing them to do to get in the garden, to actually do things. That's not what it's about. Like, have them by your side, have them just kind of observe what you do. And you know what, maybe gardening won't ever be their special interest, but when they grow up, they'll actually remember those times. And maybe that, when they grow up, they'll be able to realize, you know what, that was actually a really calming experience for me. I just want to go back to a couple slides. Just give me a quick second here. Let's go back all the way over here. Just want to touch base about a couple more things. A lot of people are they're worried when they take their children out to public about any potential meltdowns. Maybe something's not going to be going their way or things like that. If you're out in a garden, if you're out among plants, who cares if you have a meltdown? Who cares? Nobody can hear you. But you know what? I will bet you almost dollar to donuts that if you do have your child out there, or if you have someone out there that is on the spectrum, they will relax about it, and they'll actually find it quite therapeutic just to kind of be detached for a little bit. And if they are, if they do have a special interest, nurture it, let them kind of explore it, and give them as much support as you can to let them figure out if that's actually for them or not. If you shut down their interests, they're going to feel kind of rejected, and they're not going to feel like they belong anywhere. They're not going to feel like themselves. If their special interest is gardening, encourage it. Get them a garden bed. Do what's possible to help nurture that. If their special interest is Star Wars, you know what? Take them to Star Wars. Let them kind of explore it as much as they can. Let them be experts on their subject of choosing. You know what? Maybe gardening is not for them. Maybe Star Wars is. Maybe they'll want to go to all the Star Wars Comic-Con functions, and they'll want to be dressing up in Star Wars attire and things like that. If that's going to help regulate them, go for it. Do that. Speak their language. Connect to them that way. I talked a little bit about physical limitations before, about how I have a major heart condition. I've had about 7 open heart surgeries, a multitude of pacemaker surgeries, and a few cardioversions. What a lot of people do when they find out, they're like, wow, you're up and walking? Like, you're alive? Like, you're here? I'm like, yeah, of course I am. But that plays in every aspect of my daily life. I have to figure out how to do things with less energy and with less physical capability than other people. And that's one of the reasons why I put so much thought, and that why I'm so interested in gardening vertically, because it requires so little effort on my part once the base infrastructure is put in place, that I'm able to get a large amount of yield from a small space. I can basically stand in one spot, and I can hoe, I can weed, I can harvest, and I can touch a lot of aspects, a lot of parts of my garden without really having to move too much. I know in the past, my wife has, after surgery, my wife has literally set me up with a stool in the garden to sit on, because I couldn't really move. And I sat at that garden bed, and I was at that garden weeding, I was kind of pruning the plants, and I was harvesting. And you know what? For me, that was the best type of healing possible. That was being in my element. That was me being able to relax, even though I wasn't physically able to do very much. But because I had that vertical infrastructure put into place, I was able to do a lot within the space I was in. I know that I was speaking to a couple people before, and I know that some people are in wheelchairs, and they're not able to be as mobile as people who are not. They need they need things to be made more accessible for them. Let's say you do have room for a backyard garden in a wheelchair. You can set it up in such a way that not only are they able to reach everything and harvest everything, but having things grow up along the side, it'll make them a lot easier for them to for things to be accessible. Yes, you know what? They may need a little bit of help, just like I need a bit of help to put up my infrastructure. But that initial help and that initial work will set us up in the long run. I talked a little bit about my heart, and like people, they don't realize I also have a physical disability. I can't do a lot of things. So I've always had to keep that in mind. I've always had to keep in mind, okay, well, how can I adjust? How can I be doing these things? I know a lot of people perceive people on the spectrum as weird and things like that because we have our special interests, because we have the one or two ideas that we just solely want to talk about. And you know what? For me, that's fine. People tell me I'm weird. I'm like, yeah, I'm the crazy garden guy. I'm fine with that. And but if you take the time to reconnect with us on our level of interest, mine is gardening. I will literally talk your ear off all day about the subject. I'll talk about all the different types of tomatoes. I'll talk about interplanting. I'll talk about what worked, what didn't. I'll talk about how you can be installing certain infrastructure into your garden. I'll be talking about the different types of plants that you can be eating. I'll even start speaking to you about the smell of the tomato leaves in the summer on my hands. When I'm out in the summer and I'm pruning the tomatoes, my hands will become almost black because there's so much greenery that I'm touching on the tomato plants. They'll first become dark green, then dark green, and then they'll become black because there's so much buildup there. And when you smell them, it's just like it's being hit in the nose with the smell of tomatoes. My daughter will actually say, Papa, you smell like tomatoes in the summer. That's your smell. And on one hand, I'm like, great, thanks. On the other hand, it's like, you know what? Like, I'm out there doing what I love every day. I might do it with a little bit of sense of humor. I might do it with a little bit of a different style, or I might do it a little bit differently than other people would. But I'm out there and I'm enjoying myself day after day. The biggest thing for me is when I'm on the verge of losing control or having a meltdown, or I feel myself getting unregulated or things like that, I'll go out of the garden. I'll start connecting with plants. I'll start digging my hands into the soil. I'll start connecting with Mother Nature just like that. I'll literally go through the garden. I'll start touching the different plants that I have in my garden. The reason for that is because it's such a huge sensory input. The tomato leaves, they smell like tomatoes. But when I go over to the raspberries, they're kind of prickly. So when I touch them, they kind of prickle my fingers a little bit. And then when I go over to the broccoli and I touch those leaves have more of a kind of a ripple effect to them. Or if I'm going over to the garlic stalks are kind of long and skinny, and I can run my fingers along there. And the leaves, they almost, on the edge of the garlic leaves, they're almost kind of pointy, almost razor-like. So all those different textures are a huge sensory input for me. I can go through the garden and I can touch all the different stuff in there, and I can get that sensory input that I can't necessarily get inside. All this wide range of it, plus along with smelling the flowers, and I can quite literally go up to a tomato and I can smell the fresh tomato on the plant. And of course, there's the sensory aspect of eating the fruit too. I can be going to a cucumber that's nice and crunchy. I can bite into that. And then I can go over to a raspberry that can be a little bit more tart. And there's such a contrast between the two. Raspberry, it's a tart. It's kind of a soft kind of type of berry. And then you have the cucumber, which is going to be kind of harder and crunchier. It's also a different sensory aspect when I'm eating too. having the ability to go out and calm myself into the garden and kind of regulate myself into the garden like that has made a huge difference, not only for me, but also for the people around me. I'm no longer having such big meltdowns. I'm no longer kind of losing control of my emotions and things like that. I can go out and I regulate myself. When we first kind of began to realize that I was on the spectrum and how gardening helped kind of calm me down and kind of regulate me, I would literally go to the garden every day of the week. I had one day set aside that I would go out and I would regulate myself in the garden. I would do shoveling, I would do raking, I would do whatever I needed to do in the garden, whatever task or things like that. Because I was so unregulated up to that point, I was so kind of worked up through my whole life that I couldn't properly actually function without doing that. And I would spend one day right from when I woke up all the way till it got too dark. Sometimes even when it was dark, I would take a headlamp and I would finish what I was doing. And luckily over time, I've been able to regulate myself a little bit better. So I haven't had to spend a whole day in the garden each week. I haven't had to block off that whole time. There are times, yes, I'm saying, okay, well, I need time for myself. I'm going to go in the garden. I'm going to kind of regulate myself a little bit more that way. But I haven't had to block off that whole day going forward. I haven't had to block off that whole day recently in the past little while. Sometimes I would, to even like calm down, I wouldn't even just work. I would take a chair and I would sit there and I'd look at my plants, not even really listening to the birds. I would just look at the plants and I would be looking at them and be like, wow, like, like I did that. I planted it, I grew it, I watered it, and now it's like that. And I would just look at the garden and I would just kind of look at it from a different perspective versus going and working in there. I would kind of look at it, and I would also get kind of lost in thought. I'm thinking, okay, what has worked this year? What hasn't worked? What can I be doing differently? There's a lot of the times when I was sitting there, I would just be lost in thought, not because I had nothing to think about, just because it was so calming to sit among the plants. There's been a couple times that I was actually I was there sitting so long that my wife would actually peek out the window to make sure I was okay because I wasn't moving at all. I was just sitting there kind of just enjoying. That's the type of effect that gardening that has on me, and then it has on multiple people that I know. And then, like, if you know someone that's struggling with self-regulation, it could have the exact same effect with them as well. I know that gardening can be expensive for a lot of people, and I know there can be quite a few barriers in place to get a garden set up. But you don't have to be setting up a huge garden initially. Maybe gardening for you at this time will look like a big pot on your balcony that you can stick a dwarf tomato plant in. Maybe it's that big pot's going to contain flowers that's going to cascade down the edge of it. Maybe gardening will be beans that you'll plant. It's different for everyone. And maybe if you have a big pot, your sense of calming is just going to be going out and just looking at that big pot full of plants. It's going to be looking at those flowers that you have in there. It's going to be smelling them. It's going to be looking at the bees and insects coming to pollinate them. Maybe that's going to be what your form of gardening looks like. Or maybe your form of gardening is just eating all your spouse's harvest. It doesn't really matter. Everyone's different. Everyone's going to have a different style. Everyone's going to have a different capabilities of what they are to gardening. Or maybe you don't even have a spot for gardening. You don't have a spot for a pot. Maybe your garden is at a community garden, and maybe that's where you connect with your social circle. Maybe you can connect with your community through your community garden that way. And that's great too. You're going to have the help and support that you can potentially get at that community garden as well. It's different for everyone. Maybe you're one and done. You put your plants in the ground, you kind of walk away and you kind of let them fend for yourself, but you feel great doing that. Or maybe like you don't have a space for a garden, you can't get into a community garden. And maybe your version of gardening is the kind of more of a guerrilla gardening that's planting things on the boulevard or sprinkling wildflowers on people's front lawn. Now, don't hold me that because I don't want to be liable, but maybe that's going to be your form of gardening. And if that's where you get your enjoyment, and that's where you get your regulation, you know what? Go for it. Connect any way that feels best, and that's within not only your financial but also your physical abilities as well. We haven't built. It took me 7 years to build the infrastructure in our Chilliwack garden. 7 years to get to the point where it was kind of done. So it really doesn't happen overnight. It does take time, especially if you're having limitations. Limitations with physical abilities or with money. My big driving force each season when I was gardening was, okay, I need to do this project. One year it was putting in the garden beds. And the next year was the arbors and trellises. The other year was irrigation. I always had a project on my mind that I had to finish because, to say plainly, I was obsessed with that project, with getting it done. I was obsessed with not just leaving it halfway done. It does take time to build. So start small. That's my biggest thing. Don't be thinking that you have to set up a great big garden initially. You can set up something small, and you can start there. And you know what? If it works, expand. If you enjoy it, expand. But if you're having difficulties or you realize it's not for you, you know what? There's no sense of forcing yourself to do something that doesn't quite work. Start small, go from there, and then you can figure out if it's really for you or not. If you can figure out if it's really going to be something you can connect with, if it is really going to help your self-regulation or not. For me and for my daughter and for our family, it helped us tremendously. That's kind of where our company kind of came from. I spoke a little bit before about how my wife was telling me, go in the garden and relax out there. That's kind of how Spectrum Gardening was born. She realized how much I enjoyed it. She realized that how much I kind of knew about certain subjects, and she realized how much role it plays in my life. And she said, you know what? Why don't you start a gardening company? Why don't you start a company and you can do this throughout your life? And I'm like, wow, that's a great idea. And that's exactly how our company was born. It was born out of my passion and her suggestion to put the two and two together in practicality. Sometimes answers aren't easy to get. Myself, I never would have had the idea to create the company. I never would have had that kind of light bulb moment. But she was able to be a little bit more removed from myself. If you do have a support worker, or if you do have someone in your life that's a little bit removed, they can see things that you can't. Maybe they're encouraging you to go to the beach. Maybe that's where you relax. Maybe they're encouraging you to go out for a walk along the community gardens because they can see how much effect that has with calming you down. Having those supports and having those different perspectives in your life can be huge, but it's also, you have to be willing to listen to them. You have to be willing to listen to their ideas, if you will, their ideas of what's working for you as a person, what's actually affecting you in a positive way. Gardening is such a huge point of our life that when we moved from Chilliwack, when we were looking at different properties, we were looking at more of a one of the options was a townhouse property, and our daughter said, "No, we have to have a garden. That's who we are. We have to have a yard. We have to have somewhere that can grow veggies." Her source of regulation is going out of the garden, making a salad for herself. That's how she gets regulated. She goes out by picking what I've grown for her. That's her sense of regulation. Yeah, she enjoys being on the garden. She enjoys the plants, but she also tells me, "Oh, Papa, you talk too much about gardening. You talk too much about plants. You and your garden." But in the summer, I'll see her sitting on the edge of the garden beds, munching on leaves of lettuce, cucumbers, and tomatoes, and things like that. So even though she kind of gives me a hard time of it, and she says, "Yeah, I talk too much of it," I can see the positive effects that it has on her. Not only I can see the positive effects because she's so much calmer when she's around the plants and things like that, but I can see nutritionally she has this benefit. She has a huge benefit of getting freshly grown veggies that she literally picks right off the vine, and she eats them right there. You can't beat the health benefits of that. You just really can't. I know I've talked a lot about autism. I've talked a little bit about my heart condition and growing vertically, and the different amendments that you can use in the garden. I'm not sure if Rebecca has any questions for me or anything like that, or if anyone else does have questions. But is there any questions, Rebecca?
Oh, that was really great. I'm a pretty new gardener, so a lot of that information was really, really helpful. I think, yeah, just your advice on starting small, I think that's good. And yeah, I get overwhelmed at the gardening store just looking at all of the different products and wondering what I should use or what I should try. So yeah,
it can be extremely overwhelming. I know even when I go in myself and I'm looking at the wall of fertilizer, I'm like, whoa, whoa, like all these different colors and all these different labels, right? And it's like, which one is really the best?
So, yeah. And I think I get like, each seed packet will tell you what each plant needs, but I sort of just get overwhelmed with like, oh, if I'm going to plant, I don't know, if I have like 10 different things I'm going to plant, I just find it totally overwhelming to try and figure out what to do for each one.
Yes, so it is. You know what I've kind of done in that regard? For me, it's kind of survival of the fittest. I'll group certain types of veggies together, and I'll be like, okay, all these type of veggies get planted the same way.
Yeah, okay.
All these other type of veggies get planted the same way, even if the instructions are slightly differently. And most of the time it works out pretty well. It really does.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, I guess my other thing is that like last year in one spot I planted beans that like grew up this trellis, I guess it is.
Full beans.
And they did really well, but then I know that people say too that you shouldn't plant the same thing year after year in the same spot.
Yeah.
Do you think that's true, or should I plant something different?
Yes, it is. But also at the same time, like, us urban gardeners, we don't have a lot of room.
Yeah.
We really don't. I know it's recommended to switch out crops each year, but I just want to switch to a slide real quick. I will rotate them as much as possible. But like, for example, in our old place, this was our tomato bed.
Yeah.
And I grew tomatoes in there for 5 years straight before we moved. And we all know how much disease tomatoes are prone to, right?
Yeah.
Like blight and things like that, and how blight can live in the soil for 5 years. And like, if you have it in your soil, it's like detrimental. You can't plant any tomatoes, eggplants, potatoes, or peppers in there, right?
So yeah, but it was okay.
Yeah, it was totally fine. What I would do each year is I would go, as soon as I saw blight happening, I would take out that plant and I would clean up all the organic matter.
Oh, okay.
In the tomato. At the end of the year, there wasn't any tomato leaves left. That was solely to prevent like like disease harboring in the soil.
Right. Okay.
And I'll be doing the same thing on these 2 beds here. I'll be planting tomatoes in them year after year. And I'll just make sure to clean up all the organic matter. You know, like cleaning up all the organic matter and all the plant material, it's great. And you can kind of prevent disease from harboring in your soil that way, but you can't prevent pests.
Right.
That one you can't prevent. You can kind of deter it a little bit by interplanting. But once a pest has found its way into the soil and they know that crop is always being planted there, there's nothing you can do other than planting it somewhere else.
Right. Okay.
There just really isn't, to say it plainly. But most of the time with home gardeners, yeah, you know, we do have to worry about pests to a certain extent, but it's not of a huge concern for us as big as commercial farmers.
Right.
Because commercial farmers, they need to have that crop that's grown and harvested and sold to make their money. Us people that grow at home, you know, we're growing it for nutrition. We're growing it for fun. We're growing it for the enjoyment. So like if we do get a little bit of decreased harvest, it's not like we're having to sell it to make our money to make a living, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
So it's a little bit different in that regard.
Yeah, and I haven't been planting like squash or pumpkins or anything because we don't have much room, but I hadn't thought of doing those vertically. So I might try that this year.
What you can also do is you can potentially grow them on the edge of your garden bed as well and let them cascade out.
Oh, okay.
Like in any walkways or things like that.
Yeah.
Like if you're able to get around them and things like that, you can plant them on the edge, like kind of where my mouse is here.
Yeah.
You can let them cascade this way, or plant them along the edge here and plant them this way. What I did, can I zoom in? No, I can't. What I did along here is like I've got these big arbors along here, but I also have little pieces of the same type of metal panels I use. They're only like this big or something like that, right? Yeah. And I put them on the edge, and my cucumbers, they grew up them and they flopped over. So I was able to give them a little bit more space to grow up before they went on the ground.
Right.
Kind of makes sense. So I was able to kind of maximize that a little bit more, but they were only like this tall. So I was very easily able to still reach over to them to the middle of the garden bed.
Right. Fun. Yeah. Well, now I just hope the weather starts warming up. So
yeah, well, it's really nice and sunny where I am today. So but unfortunately, I've got a whole bunch of computer work to do. So.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much. That was really great. And
you're very welcome.
Yes. And have a great weekend.
You too.
Okay. Take care.